Hey, Jonah.
Hey, Peter.
Well, we hadn't done this for a little while, so we're getting back to the swing of things.
That's right.
And the first thing I thought we could talk about was kind of about how conservative and liberal intellectual culture are responding to what I think we probably both agree is the power shift that's likely taking place away from Democrats and towards Republicans.
Away from Democrats towards Republicans.
Oh, sorry. Did I say that? No. That's away from Republicans and towards Democrats. One of the things that we used to find that people at the New Republic and other places I knew used to complain about a lot a few years ago was the kind of lockstep unity of the conservative punditocracy versus the much more fractious, less disciplined, less kind of we're all on the same team kind of nature of the liberal punditocracy. I think that was a real feature of the Clinton years and the early Bush years. But I think it's been shifting a bit. I think that the creation of the little blogosphere, which is more partisan than the kind of pre-blogosphere liberal punditocracy, and with a self-confidence fueled by the feeling that Republicans have been wrong about big thing after big thing after big thing, has created a kind of more unified intellectual climate on the left than existed in the 90s or in the first year or two after 9/11. And I think that my sense is on the right that that while there are still, there's still going to be people, like the Japanese still fighting World War II in 1951 in caves, maybe the absurd Michelle Malkin and Coulter types, that actually, you see with people like David Brooks and Ross Douthat and others, a kind of, and even on the Sarah Palin thing, I've been struck by the degree by how many conservatives have stated what I think is pretty indisputable, but that she's not really performed well. That there are questions about whether she's intellectually up to the job. So to me, this seems like a kind of a hopeful sign of a kind of a thawing of what I used to see as a kind of a very rigid kind of set of conservative talking points, and more of an open intellectual environment in which the prospect of defeat leads to a lot of self-criticism.
Okay. There are a lot of fights or disagreements I could pick with some of that. There's places where I agree with it too. I'm not sure it's fair to lump Michelle Malkin in with Ann and whatever disagreements I have there. That's fine. But
you think Ann Coulter is worse than Michelle Malkin?
Yes, I do.
Okay. That's a low bar. But go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm exhausted. I've been on the road, been up since way before dawn in Iowa this morning. I have some problems with sort of the way you were characterizing the history of all of this. And first of all, I don't know how many columns I've written over the last 10 years, sort of trying to throw cold water on the constant assertions of the conservative crackup, where E.J. Dionne or someone from the New Republic or someone from the New York Observer points to some internecine squabble on the right and says, aha, the cultural contradictions of conservatism, it's finally coming unglued. These guys don't, the reality that, that free market libertarianism and cultural conservatism don't mesh is finally becoming apparent. The edifice is falling apart. And now your version of it is that all the sort of conservative punditocracy have been in lockstep. And maybe they have been there has been too much unanimity out there, but that hasn't been the analysis that I remember coming from a lot of liberals, including at the New Republic, over these years. I think there's been a lot of wishful thinking. I mean, we're seeing a lot of wishful thinking these days from people like Dionne and Harold Meyerson, who are constantly, saying, aha, finally, the conservatism is dead once again. I think all of this is premature and sort of silly. But I do think you're basically right that there are some interesting new arguments bubbling up on the conservative side of the aisle, both among actual true blue conservatives and, or I should say true red conservatives these days, and and nominal conservatives that the press likes to highlight from time to time.
Meaning who?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, New Republic did this piece about the swelling ranks of the Obama cons, and they picked people like Wick Allison as the former publisher of NR, as if it was this incredibly profound break with movement conservatism. And Wick Allison, I know a lot of people who are fans of his, but the idea that he's sort of central to conservative thought or anything like that is sort of goofy. There've been others. I mean, I don't want to. There's a riot of silliness breaking out among conservatives right now, of people trying to read out heretics and beating up on people like Christopher Buckley and Kathleen Parker for being, traitors this and disloyal that, or trying to suck up to the East Coast liberal establishment and all this kind of stuff. And I think that whole argument is overblown, and even in the rare places where it's accurate, it's incredibly counterproductive. So I don't really want to start feeding into it. But I do think if you look at sort of the younger guys, Ross Douthat and that crowd, there are some serious, legitimately conservative people who are looking. So I would say they're sort of Disraelian. Disraeli is sometimes overlooked as one of the founders of modern conservatism, but he had a very sort of proactive view towards government and one nation politics and all that kind of stuff, and was not a pure laissez-faire guy by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that there are those like Frum and Douthat and those guys who are looking towards being more creative in terms of reforming public policy and all the rest. I think David Frum is sort of an odd, or I don't know if he's odd, he's sort of sui generis. I mean, I think we've talked about this before. David just is so desperate for the culture war to end. And this is my own take on it, on David. I'm not sure he would agree with all of it, but my take on David is that he's so desperate for the culture war to end that he's constantly finding evidence of its demise, even when I don't think that evidence is all of that strong. And he sort of shares with Bill Kristol, to a certain extent, a tendency to, if he says it is so, it will become so. A desire to write self-fulfilling prophecies, and so David, I think, is really desperate to, or I should say, eager to move beyond a lot of what he considers the stale old fights in American politics, and he needs to sort of downplay the significance of some of those fights on the right, when I still think they're very, very significant.
Well, let me try to explain.
Yeah, sure. Go on. I'm rambling.
What I thought. I think that there were a whole generation of there were a whole group of conservatives. I think of them kind of baby boomers and younger, maybe kind of your age or my age, who were extremely emboldened because, in their view, they had never seen the American right be proven completely wrong on anything. That conservatives were very emboldened by the belief that they had been right about the Cold War. I totally dispute that analysis, but I think that was a strong view. Right about the Gulf War, and conservatives were right about the Gulf War, in my opinion. Right about welfare reform, which is a very, very big debate of the 1990s. And I think that sense of self-confidence, in my reading, produced a sense of unity that carried through in a lot of the debates. So that in a lot of the big debates of the 90s and early Bush era, it was very hard to find much conservative dissension at all. I mean, I don't remember, on impeachment, very few prominent conservatives were not in support of that. Bush v. Gore, I thought it was shocking to me how few prominent conservatives were willing to say that was a bad decision. The Iraq War, obviously, the Bush tax cut, all the way through most of Bush's first term. And I think it seems to me that the weight of the events in Iraq and Katrina have changed that dynamic to some degree. Whereas I think what happened on the left was, for baby boom liberals and people of, say, my age, there were formative experiences in which you, as much as you hated to admit it, you had to acknowledge that that conservatives had been at least partially vindicated by things. The Gulf War would be the most obvious example, but welfare reform would be another, where, Patrick Moynihan, who was the guru, said it was going to be an utter disaster, and people resigned from the Clinton administration, and it didn't turn out to be an utter disaster. And I think that sense of, that was a chastening, that had a chastening impact. But I think that the recent experience has been the exact reverse of just seeming, conservatives, in the liberal perspective, which I would share, be wrong on just so many big things that it's created a sense of, it's created the kind of intellectual self-confidence on the left that I think conservatives had, 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Yeah, I guess I gotta sort of disagree with the warp and woof of that. I mean, I know that you're intellectually honest and committed to the idea that somehow the Bush years have completely discredited conservatism. But it's funny, you want to stipulate that as if that is a consensus among all right-thinking people, but you want to disagree with the ideas that somehow the conservatives were right to think that they were right on the Cold War or that kind of thing.
But I'm not saying that. I mean, I obviously don't believe that conservatives believe the Bush administration has repudiated conservatism, but I think there is a sense that, I think there are a lot of conservatives who are saying that conservatism needs to evolve, and it can't be stuck in the late 1970s. And that some of the Bush administration's failures have resulted from an attempt to reuse the formulas that worked in earlier. I mean, this is a big Brooks theme, that Americans' anxieties have shifted and conservatism hasn't. And I think all of the kind of, quote, the people who want to find new roles for government, whether they be those, Reihan Salam and Duhat or Fromm or Brooks, are kind of making that argument.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think that there were more arguments among conservatives in the 1990s. I mean, there was considerable pushback on the, it's funny. I mean, David's evolution. I mean, David Brooks in some ways, although I hold David in vastly higher esteem than I do Andrew Sullivan, but there's a similar sort of theme there in that they're both trying to atone for positions that they themselves held, and David was the champion of national greatness conservatism.
Yes.
And David wrote most of that stuff for the Weekly Standard. And I think it's fair to say he rejects all of that stuff now. But,
although national greatness conservatism was also about trying to find a conservative role for the federal government. So in that way, there is a consistency.
Well, okay, that's fair. There's a consistency there. But there were lots of people, including me in my own small way, but there were lots of people on the right who had deep and profound problems with the push for this national greatness stuff. And that was an argument. I mean, it didn't get a lot of press outside of the conservative world in the 1990s because the stakes were so low. I mean, I remember one of the first panels I ever did in Washington, I remember my opening line was, never have I been so torn about an issue that matters so little. But I think that, so I mean, I agree with you that there's this renewed push towards sort of rethinking some public policy issues and the rest. And, people like Ramesh Ponnuru have sort of been leaders on this behind the scenes for a very long time, and never seem to quite get the credit that they deserve. But I think that, and I think one of the reasons why Palin plays into this, even though, I think Palin gets something of a bad rap, is, and again, I think Brooks is sort of telling on this, is that Brooks basically sees Palin as another George Bush. And Brooks is sort of refighting the last war and thinks that Bush was incompetent. Bush was a guy who surrounded himself with cronies who didn't care about the intricacies of public policy. He certainly couldn't talk about Reinhold Niebuhr with him, and Lord knows that's disqualifying in public life today, according to David. And sort of sees Sarah Palin as Bush in a dress.
Yeah, as do I.
And I think even if I was willing to concede those arguments, and I'm not quite sure that I am. I don't think that. I think it's sort of a silly argument because Sarah Palin is the nominee for the vice presidency, not the presidency.
But she's the person. And she's now become the rock star on the conservative grassroots, hasn't she? I mean, so it says something about where the mood is.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think she is sort of a culture war symbol for the right and for the left. I mean, the same things that, I mean, there are a lot of people. I think Ross is one of them. I think I'm one of them. That whatever other problems we may or may not have with Sarah Palin, we certainly love her for her enemies, and I think that the reason, I think one of the reasons why David is so horrified is because he doesn't want to have those fights anymore. He just wants to move on, and it'd be nice if we could sort of decide where the fault lines among the American people are that confirm the arguments that we want to have, but that doesn't always happen. I wish we would never have to talk or argue about, gay marriage, but the fact is that gay marriage is an issue, and you got to argue about what the issues are and not try and create issues that people don't care about. And I guess you and I would disagree about what those issues are that people care about.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we weren't going to talk about this right now, but maybe this is a good segue into this question about the culture war, because, I mean, I guess I agree with David Frum that, I do think, and lots of other people have made this up, I do think the culture war, there's real reason to believe the culture war is starting to ebb. I mean, the culture war is partly about racial anxiety and animosity, which I think has diminished compared to where it was in the 1970s and 80s because of the decline in crime, and the end of busing is an issue, the end of the repeal of welfare. There's obviously it's still a powerful force in American politics, but not like it was back then. And I think gay marriage, and I don't know if you disagree with it. I mean, I think gay marriage is fading as an issue in intensity as you have the rise of a younger generation that is not as bothered by it, and even the Republicans are accepting civil unions and abortion. The Democrats have given up on gun control. It's barely been an issue in this election. So, I mean, abortion will remain a powerful issue, I think, for a long time to come. But, other than that, I mean, for me, the attempts to link, Obama to heirs after trying to link Kerry to, the SWIFT votes are an attempt to make every election about the issues of the 1960s. And with Kerry, at least he was around at that point as an adult. I mean, I think part of what makes it so fanciful with Obama is that the guy just has no real connection to that. I mean, I don't want to get into the weeds of the Bill Ayers thing, but he wasn't around whether as an adult when the Weathermen were really active. So I just think that those issues are just much more distant from him and from all of the people who are coming of age in the kind of post-baby boom generation.
You may be right. I'm one of these people who actually thinks, though, that what we call the culture war is a much older thing than the 1960s, and it surges at certain times and it ebbs at other times.
Yes.
But there were all sorts of culture war things wrapped up in the Cold War. There were before the Cold War, The Nation did this wonderful series of articles during the progressive era called In These United States, in which you had all sorts of sort of snobby progressives talking about the rubes who live in the rural parts of America. It was basically, city mice versus country mice and that kind of thing. I think if you look at the trends in religion, religiosity and people who go to church or synagogue and people who don't and all the rest, the idea, the icons or the flashpoints of the culture war may be changing somewhat. But I don't see really that much evidence that these sort of fundamental disagreements about what kind of country we need to be or what kind of country we are actually going to go away. They may indeed ebb. I mean, I think they certainly are ebbing right now because of the economic stuff and because of the peculiarities of this specific presidential race and the shortcomings of John McCain and the rest. But I would be glad to make some sort of Julian Simon-like bet that, in 10 years from now, we'll take 5 or 6 culture war items, and 10 years from now, they're still going to be around, and there's still going to be a major fault line upon which politics works in this country.
Well, I agree with you. I don't think the culture war never entirely disappears. I mean, I agree with you. Even in the 50s, which some people would point to as an era where there was very little culture war, McCarthyism was very much, in some ways, about culture war. The attacks on the East Coast, elites, and it had an ethnic component, kind of, the kind of Germans and Irish in the middle of the country versus the East Coast. So, but I think there are times when it's it was culture. The 20s was much more a culture war decade than the 30s, and I think the 70s were more about and 80s and even 90s were more about the culture war than the 50s and the first part of the 60s. And so I think that it's going to. I think it will ebb. As you say, I think partly because this recent iteration of the culture war was not about Protestants versus Catholics and prohibition. It's been about the role of women. It's been about gays and lesbians. It's been about the relation between African Americans and whites. And I think those things have settled to some degree. And maybe we'll get revved up by new culture war issues having to do with immigration and questions of sovereignty. We'll find, it does seem like this question about, international legal relation, American sovereignty versus international legal norms has the potential to be a new flashpoint of culture war. But it just seems to me, if you were looking to the crystal ball for the next few years, you look into an American recession, huge questions about the role of government regulation, of Wall Street versus populist impulses. I just don't see that, and even in this election, where culture war stuff just doesn't seem to be really, is kind of the dog that isn't barking.
Again, I think that's right. I mean, this is one of these great ironies that I think a lot of pundits on the left and the right miss, which is that when times are good, the culture war, when times are economically good, the culture war becomes more important.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
And politics abhors a vacuum. And when the economy is bad, the economy fills that vacuum like nothing else. And which is obviously, for all sorts of reasons, some defensible, some not, in my mind. That's one of the things that's putting such a wind at Barack Obama's back. But when times are good, then all of a sudden the economy fades into the background, and something else has to come in. And people get to start saying, we have the money and the wherewithal to think about what kind of country we want to be, and the left has one very specific, very concrete cultural prism, and the right has a pretty concrete cultural prism, and they both move front and center as political issues.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think another way of putting that is that I think populism is always a powerful force in American politics, but sometimes economic populism is more powerful, and sometimes cultural populism is more popular. And I think that the 90s and the 80s were clearly eras, the 70s through the 90s were clearly eras in which cultural populism, I think, was more powerful. I think that the Republican Party, cultural populism has become heart and soul of the Republican Party. Economic populism is, Thomas Franks has bemoaned, has been relatively weak within the kind of mainstream Democratic Party compared to in past eras, and just weak as a force in American politics. But I think it's likely to be coming back in a significant way. And I think one of the ironies is that it's in some ways it may bedevil Democrats even more than Republicans, because Democrats are going to be in power, and some of what they're going to try to do, it seems to me, is going to be economically orthodox in a way that is going to may stir up economic populist resentments.
No, I think that's possible. This reminds me, and I'm sorry, I apologize for not talking to you about talking about this beforehand. But
you're ambushing me like David Frum with Rachel Maddow. Shame on you! Damn you, Goldberg.
I don't think it's an ambush. I'm actually just kind of curious what you think about it. Byron York had a post in the corner where he excerpted something from Marcos Molitzis, from Daily Cause, and. I don't read Koss, so this was sort of news to me, but apparently Koss was talking about how, for several weeks now, he's been talking about how liberals need to run up such an enormous victory that they completely crush conservatives and break their backs, break their spirits, and prevent them from saying that, from distancing themselves from McCain and saying, oh, McCain wasn't a real conservative, and completely discrediting sort of conservatism as a political and economic and governmental philosophy. And what I think is sort of interesting about that is, and you hear that from other places as well, all this sort of, Harold Meyerson and E.J. Dionne type stuff about how this sort of proves that the sort of anti-regulation animus of the right has been completely and totally discredited, and it's going to be gone for a generation, and we're going to have a new era of new deals as far as the eye can see and all the rest. And as silly as I think all of that is as analysis, I think it's in some ways even sillier as wishful thinking. Because, would you actually want a situation in which the sort of the libertarian free market ethos of the Republican Party is completely pelted from the public stage in national politics? Would you want it so that everyone in the room is basically having an argument about which interventions in the private sector should win out in a political contest, rather than where government should draw the line? It seems to me that I've always argued that you always want a libertarian in the room, even if you disagree with them, just so that they ask the important skeptical questions about any government action. But the logical upshot of all this is that you don't even want these people having a voice in politics.
I guess my view would be they're libertarians and then they're libertarians. If you think about American politics in the 1950s, which is, there is this, funny thing, that conservatives idealized the culture of the 1950s and Democrats idealized the economics of the 1950s. But I'm one of them, and I think that there is an incredible amount to admire in what happened in the United States economically between World War II and Vietnam. Now, you might say that we can never recapture that because it was based on, there were things going on in the world. But, one of the things that John Judas and others have written about the 1950s was that it was a time when, for instance, American corporations were willing to accept labor unions. There was not a kind of the belief that for businesses to thrive, they had to crush and destroy labor unions, which had been there earlier in the 20th century, and then I think to some degree re-emerged starting in the 1970s. There was a belief that there should be that business would have a seat at the table, but that it did not have the fierce ideological hostility to government's role in fiscal stimulus and in economic regulation and labor unions that developed in the 1970s and continued into the Reagan era and the Bush era. And I do think that would be much better. I think we will be much better off if instead of trying to derail the healthcare plans that come out next year, business sits down at the table and tries to figure out how they can help craft healthcare plans that won't destroy them, but actually they will take seriously their role as stewards of trying to help to increase healthcare coverage. Then similarly on global warming, they will say, we see ourselves as having some kind of responsibility to try to do something about global warming. So, I do think that would be a good thing.
Okay, well, I don't want to get into a big argument about the perils of corporatism, where government and business consider themselves great partners, even though I think that's an incredibly pernicious approach to public policy. But let me just sort of throw it out there in the context of the conversation that we're having. It seems to me that if, as you say, the Republican Party is largely a culturally populist party, and I think there's certainly some merit to that.
I guess I would say I think it uses cultural populism as its most effective tool in winning elections. I guess I would put it slightly differently, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, it seems to me in a situation where you have one party that is, the Democratic Party, which is economically populist, that's basically how it holds white working class people, right, is the economic populism stuff. And then it is a sort of coalition of government unions and identity politics organizations or constituencies. So you have that one party, and then if you had a if the Larry Kudlows are handcuffed to a radiator in the basement and not allowed to have any part in this conversation, you have in the other party a bunch of Mike Huckabee, Sarah Palin, or at least the imagined Sarah Palin types, who Buchananites, maybe Jim Webb becomes a Republican again. That seems to me to be a recipe for an incredibly poisonous and nasty kind of politics, in which you have two parties racing to the bottom to figure out which demographics, essentially, of the American population should be the winners and which ones should be the losers.
But,
and
go ahead.
I mean, you're going to say that that's what we have now.
No. I'm going to say I don't think that's what's going to happen. I mean, I think first of all that underestimates significantly the degree to which the Democratic Party is an economic populist party, as you know. I mean, as I think you're defining it. I mean, remember, a lot of the people who will be in charge in the Obama administration are Clinton administration veterans. Look who Obama is citing: Paul Volcker. And then he's got Rubin and Summers and lots of kind of younger guys who work for these people. I mean, I think there could be a big battle within the Obama administration about, along the same lines that you had at the beginning of the Clinton administration, over kind of the fiscal orthodox position of Wall Street and the kind of more economic populist position that maybe the Netroots will support. Although even the Netroots, I think, is not that clearly defined on some of these economic issues. The labor unions, of course, will be on that side. But I don't think that the outcome is preordained. And I don't think Obama has been particularly wild-eyed on this stuff. So I don't think, I guess my view is that the Chamber of Commerce, Wall Street, even notwithstanding this crash, are powerful players, and they're going to be powerful players probably in both parties. It's just that I like the way that I like it when they defined their interests as they did in the 1950s, more than I think some of them have in the last couple of decades. That's my hope. But I think they're going to be a powerful player, and they're going to push back very hard if there are strong moves towards protectionism or certainly anything like the 70% marginal tax rate of the 1970s or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was probably explaining myself poorly. I mean, I'm talking about a fairly hypothetical scenario rather than what's actually going to happen. And I'm talking about this sort of dream of forever muzzling and discrediting the free market crowd. And just for the sake of clarification, I don't consider necessarily the Chamber of Commerce and Wall Street to be the free market crowd. You certainly have to pick a little more selectively under those umbrellas, because there are lots of rent-seeking, corporatist, free trade for me but not for thee, or the other way around types at the business in the Chamber of Commerce and then the rest. I mean, a lot of these guys are entirely in favor of subsidies and tax credits and all of these kinds of things if they help their bottom lines, which is not necessarily free market. But my initial point was just simply that I don't think there are a lot of people on the. I don't think a lot of people on the left fully appreciate the role that economic conservatism and free market dogma, in the best sense of the word, actually play in the conservative movement to keep the conservative movement from becoming
kind of Buchananite.
Very Buchananite, and the idea, and I think that when people, click their ruby red slippers together, are hoping for the day that the sort of Club for Growth crowd and the Phil Grahams and all those guys are completely discredited and are no longer given any sway in public policy or any or paid any heed. If that were actually to happen, I think the Republican Party, I would leave both parties, in a heartbeat if that happened, because I think the Republican Party would become, even if I may agree with some of its specific sort of culturally conservative positions. I mean, you've heard me do this spiel before. The idea of having a contest between a nationalistic party and a socialistic party kind of wigs me out. And we saw that in the Dubai ports deal thing, right, where we had idiotic cultural nationalistic sentiment from the Republican Party saying, "Oh, we got to keep these towel heads out," and we had idiotic socialist populism coming from the Democratic Party. And it seems to me that history kind of shows that when nationalists and socialists get together, bad things happen. And the role of the economic conservatives, of the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, is to keep the Republican Party from basically just picking the winners and losers that it wants and using government the same way the left wants to use government in terms of imposing its vision all over the place.
Well,
and anyway.
You're making an interesting point. I guess the question for me is, there's certain things on the cultural aspects of the right that I really dislike, that I think are ultra-nationalist, xenophobic, and I think, can veer into bigoted. And I guess the question for me is, has the Club for Growth and Phil Gramm been a force to restrain that? I think there are lots of people in the Cato Institute who have all kinds of principled problems with some of the cultural agenda of the right that I would also have a problem with, and I think some of those people are probably voting for Obama. But my whole feeling was about the Club for Growth and Phil Gramm that they accepted all of that as part of the price for their capital gains tax cuts. Now there are fights on things like immigration, I guess, and I do prefer the Club for Growth, Wall Street Journal, Phil Gramm position on immigration, but not that much, because it is basically all about getting cheap guest workers here who can never become citizens and will have no labor, no real, it seems to me, labor protections, and so it's kind of about treating people just as workers, not as human beings. So I don't, from my point of view, which is obviously radically different than your point of view, I don't know what the payoff has been for someone of my political views of having the Club for Growth, Phil Gramm guys in the room.
Oh, first of all, look, Pat Buchanan is a guy who, I would argue has become, sort of more fascistic as he's moved left, right? He came out for capping executive and CEO pay 10 years ago. He wants to expand Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid benefits 10 years ago. Became protectionist more than that. You actually read these memos he wrote to Nixon when he was in the Nixon White House about beating up on the Wall Street boys and all that kind of stuff. He's actually been surprisingly consistent in all this kind of thing. He gave this speech at Harvard where he basically used the exact logic of the left on affirmative action and these kinds of things. Called for racial quotas for Italians and Italian Americans and Irish Americans. And I think that that's sort of the people who fought that kind of thing are in fact to speak with a sweeping generalization, the Club for Growth type people, and they are the checks on that. Economic conservatism in the Republican Party. People talk about these rifts between libertarians and conservatives. If you talk about an economic conservative, you're essentially talking about a libertarian. And one of the reasons why Buchanan was sort of purged or fled the Republican Party is because that sort of free market dogma made him ultimately unpalatable, no matter how much some people might have agreed with some of his sort of culture war shots. And in fairness to the Wall Street Journal, it's hard for me to speak authoritatively about Cato, but the Wall Street Journal, which I think is an idiotic position, but it's certainly not about guest workers. Their position on immigration is there should be an amendment to the Constitution which says there shall be open borders, which I think is nuts. But it is certainly a principled position that is not explicitly about just finding cheap labor.
Yeah. Well.
Anyway, my only point is I think that you guys tend not to. I think if the Republican Party, if the choice became between a sort of nationalistic, culturally conservative, big government, populist, sort of Buchananite Republican Party, I think you guys would lose a lot of your sort of Jim Webb, culturally conservative, Reagan Democrat, working class whites, and the Democratic Party would actually become much more left wing, and the Republican Party would become resurgent, but both parties would be unpalatable to me.
I think that's also one of the factors that is a little bit of a constraint on the degree to which the Democratic Party is going to become as economically populist as it was in the days of, say, Hubert Humphrey, as fundamentally, Hubert Humphrey didn't care about budget deficits, but it is partly because there has been an influx of kind of white-collar professional types, into the Democratic Party, that they have brought some of that sensibility of fiscal conservatism that used to be exclusively in the Republican Party. I mean, you see this in people like Howard Dean and Hillary Clinton, who are the children of kind of of that kind of white-collar republicanism. Their children being in the Democratic Party. I guess another way of thinking about it, I guess, is that Buchanan is nationalist, and economic conservatives are internationalist. Not internationalist in the sense that they like international law and international institutions, but internationalist in the sense that they believe that America has to maintain its kind of imperial role, and internationalist in the sense that they believe America has to be deeply engaged in the international economy. And so you're right. I mean, I think there is a big difference, and I think my sense is that the mood of the American people shifts. There are times when the American people are pretty gung ho for us to be an imperial power, but that there are other moments, maybe more like today, where a more inward-looking nationalism would have more appeal on the right than it did, like right after 9/11. So.
Yeah.
Should we do our third topic?
Sure. That's the left versus
Yes.
liberals thing? Okay. As some viewers may know, and even fewer care, you and I debate in a lot of places, and one of the points that you've been bringing up, which I agree has a lot of merit as a historical analysis, is that you make this case that there's a very profound and serious difference between liberals and leftists, or between liberals and radicals, and that historically the radicals actually hated the liberals more than they hated conservatives. And I think there are a lot of, I sort of break off with you there in some ways. I think that what you were having was a fight over who was going to control the leftist space so that they could then take the fight to conservatives. They found conservatives not to be a threat, and so that they went for the enemy closest to hand that they thought was standing in the way of them and real social change. But I agree with you generally that there was a lot of animosity from the sort of Marxist radical left towards the sort of vital center liberals. I mean, you wrote a lot about that in your book. And you sometimes, and I don't want to be unfair about this, but I sometimes hear you saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I sometimes hear you saying that this is sort of a metaphysical, fact of the ideological landscape, that radicals and liberals, or let's call them leftists and liberals, really sort of congenitally, it's in their nature, cats versus dogs, hate each other. And I just don't think that's true about the American political landscape of the last, first of all, 20 years. You've seen, and I certainly don't think it's true of today, and sort of Exhibit A would be the fact that, Bill Ayers, forget the Weather Underground terrorist stuff, he is certainly still a radical leftist. His education reform stuff, if you read, stuff by my colleague Stan Haaretz or from Saul Stern or from Joel Siegel, there are serious, fairly honest brokers who have looked at the things that Bill Ayers believes. If you look at the things Bill Ayers actually says to this day, he is a certifiable, honest-to-goodness, left-wing radical. And there is no evidence. I mean, we can make the argument about the guilt by association argument and how valid it is, but we've heard lots of people do that already. My only point here is that there's every bit of evidence that Ayers likes Obama, that Obama likes Ayers, that there were no sort of knockdown, drag-out fights between the two of them on education policy when Obama was at the Woods Foundation. And more broadly, Ayers is representative of mainstream liberalism's acceptance and kind of, in some ways, admiration for a whole generation of former radical, not even former, sort of, formerly famous radical leftists who have now basically matriculated into the liberal establishment. And Bill Ayers was named by Daley Man of the Year in Chicago. That is not a sign that establishment liberalism has in deep and sort of genetic distaste or dislike for the left.
Well, you're right. I mean, there have been former 60s radicals who matriculated into Tom Hayden into the liberal establishment. There are others, like David Horowitz, who moved into the conservative establishment. If I said that liberals and leftists always are hostile to one another, I think I was wrong. I think that's not true. I think that there are ebbs and flows. There are times when liberals and radicals work together fairly harmoniously. And I think, to some degree, radicals and leftists is an unfair term to use, because for me, the fundamental distinction is really between the democratic and undemocratic left. So, for me, there is an absolute ocean of difference between the Michael Harrington, Irving Howe, democratic left, and those people are radicals, or even to some degree, Chomsky, who, whatever you want to say him, is an anarchist and has never had any truck really, I think, with communist dictatorship. I mean, he's been on the anarchist left, which I think is less problematic than the authoritarian left. So I think, to be fair to people on the radical left, I think that's a really important distinction. But I think there've been times. I mean, if you look at Woodrow Wilson's campaign 916, when he spent a lot of time, talking to socialists. Or the 1930s, when there was a lot of alignment between liberals and socialists. And again, I think, to some degree, in the later 60s and into the 70s, there have been times when liberals and radicals were closer together, and there have been times when they were vehemently at odds. And like in the ADA in the late 40s and then into the 50s was a period where I think they were very much at odds, because the liberalism became so kind of hardline anti-communist, and I think they were in the 90s pretty strongly at odds too. If you look at, Ralph Nader was being sincere when he said he saw no important ideological difference between the Clinton administration and the Republicans of the era, or George W. Bush. I think that today we probably are moving in an era we are coming to a period compared to the 90s and the early Bush years, where there's some rapprochement between radicals and liberals. I mean, in the sense that mainstream liberalism has moved left in response to, I think, the events of the Bush era, and so that's put them closer. But I don't know that will necessarily continue. I mean, my sense is, if you ask people, I just was hearing Howard Zinn on the radio talking about Barack Obama, and his view was, I'm going to vote for Barack Obama and then start giving him hell the minute he's elected. And if you listen to the foreign policy left, there's been a great deal of disappointment with the positions that Obama has taken, particularly, for instance, on the Israeli-Palestinian stuff, unwillingness to talk to Hamas. Andrew Bacevich, who's a strange guy because he's kind of a cultural conservative, but is now, you could argue, a pretty important voice on the kind of the realist left. Very, very harshly, a kind of in the tradition of William Appleton Williams, has been very critical of Obama. So I don't know that.
And Charles Beard, he's got a real fondness for Charles Beard, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, exactly. And he's also actually he's got an interesting connection to Jim Webb. But Jim Webb is a big fan of Bacevich's. It's an interesting kind of whole milieu. But so I think that I agree with you. I don't think they are genetically hostile to one another. I think at times they're more hostile than each other. But I think it's also important to distinguish the democratic and anti-democratic left, because I think that it's not fair to lump all radicals together and then suggest that they're all Stalinists. They're not.
No, I think that is certainly fair. We could probably have an interesting argument about which camp to put Bill Ayers in, because I don't think he's as democratic as you probably do. But
I don't actually know. But go ahead.
But I think one of the themes that sort of comes out of that history, and I basically agree with that, is that the left and liberals get along when out of power, and then when in power, have big honkin' fights. And that seems to me to be the nature of politics generally. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I've always been writing, to get back to the beginning of this conversation, I've always been writing these, for much of the last 10 years, these sort of debunking of the conservative crackup stuff, because people don't seem to understand that when coalitions are in power, they actually have stuff to fight about. And when they're out of power, all they have to fight about are the tactics about how to get back into power. And so you had, during the Bush years, you had some really interesting fights between libertarians and social conservatives and all the rest about what actual public policy should be. My sense is that if Obama wins, which I think is the way to bet, you're going to see, the prophecies of conservative demise debunked very, very quickly, and you're going to see conservatives really enjoying being on offense for a change. And you're going to see a lot of I think you're right, you're going to see a lot of these fights among liberals and the left about what course the country should take, and you're much more optimistic than I am about which side Barack Obama is going to come down on in all of that. I would predict, and I'm sure it'll come up again in a future conversation, that there is going to be monumental overreach in what will in effect be a Nancy Pelosi prime ministership. And it will be great fun to watch from my vantage point as I try to hide all my money from you people in tax shelters.
Well, good luck.
Tell me about it.
What you see as overreach is probably not what I see as overreach. I mean, I'm not necessarily. I wouldn't even suggest that I would take the liberal side in all of these liberal versus left arguments. I mean, I'm
not saying that you would.
But I think that. I think what we might agree is I think Obama will have an enormous opportunity because the Republican Party is not dead. Conservatives not dead. It will revive, but it's at a low ebb. It's been hurt. It has some real problems now with rising demographic groups in the population, young people, Hispanics. The Democratic Party has an opportunity if it is perceived to govern, particularly on economics, in a way that people feel improves their lives, that I think could create the potential for a generation-long kind of democratic era, which is not to mean that Republicans won't win elections, but it will be more like, what the FDR threw. They'll be more like Eisenhower Republicans. It'll be the Democrats as the sun party and Republicans as the moon party. Republicans having to triangulate a bit in order to get back to power. And I think that, on the other hand, if Obama is seen to totally flail and the economy slides and slides so that it's worse, it's much, much worse 4 years from now than it is today, then the Democratic era may prove to be very short-lived.
I think that's probably certainly fair. I'm certainly too exhausted to find anything significant to disagree with there.
At least I've worn you down through sheer, just verbiage. So maybe I should stop on that high note.
That's how you people do it. All right, my friend. Well, I'll either see you here or someplace else soon enough.
Excellent. Enjoy the Heartland.
Thanks. Talk to you later.
Okay.